You're listening to the Power in Excellence podcast with Dr. John.
Hello and welcome. This is indeed the Power in Excellence podcast, and welcome to this, episode 4 of our special series, The Unseen Advantage, in which we're exploring the secret psychology of leadership. And today, we're talking about trust, that invisible infrastructure that you only really notice when it cracks. In just about every organization I work with around the world, trust is listed somewhere in their corporate values. But trust is more than a value. It's more than a standard. It's more than a principle. It really is infrastructure. But it's strange because you can't see it when it's there and you only really notice it when it's gone. It's like Wi-Fi, invisible when working and everybody gets furious when it stops. In leadership, trust operates in much the same way. When it's strong, everything feels lighter. Conversations are quicker and more fluid. People challenge ideas without challenging each other. Mistakes surface early, and energy goes towards solving problems rather than managing perceptions and impressions. But when trust weakens, something else happens. People rehearse a bit before speaking. Emails get just that bit longer and a bit more defensive. Meetings feel polite, but somehow unnatural. And nobody says out loud, hey, I think trust is declining here. No, they just adjust. But that adjustment can be very expensive. By the end of this episode, you'll see trust for what it really is. Not a soft value, not a motivational slogan to be put on a poster, but a structural force that determines whether vulnerability feels survivable. We'll explore 3 levels of trust that operate in every organization: interpersonal trust, team or group trust, systemic or institutional trust. And we'll anchor all of it in something practical and behavioral, the R.I.C.E model. Reliability, integrity, competence, and empathy and vulnerability. Because trust isn't built in mission statements or value statements, it's built in conversations. It's built in moments. I'll be right back.
Great leaders aren't born, they're built. The Power in Excellence podcast with Dr. John reveals the psychology behind influence, confidence, high performance, and human behaviour. No fluff, just powerful insights you can use immediately to lead better, think clearer, and perform at a higher level.
Let's start with something that might make you just a wee bit uncomfortable. If you want to know whether people trust you, don't ask them. Watch them. Watch how they behave. Watch how they show up in meetings. Do they think out loud? Do they offer unfinished ideas? Do they challenge you respectfully but clearly? Or do they speak carefully? Do they wait for cues? Do they wait for permission? Do they only bring to you polished conclusions? Trust is visible in what people are willing to risk. Mayer Davis and Sherman define trust as the willingness to be vulnerable based on positive expectations of other people's behavior. Notice that word, vulnerable. The willingness to be vulnerable based on positive expectations of other people's behavior. Willingness to be vulnerable, hoping that other people will react and behave positively. Trust isn't about liking somebody or being liked. It's about deciding that exposure won't be punished. And in professional environments, exposure is constant. Raising a concern is exposure. Admitting uncertainty is exposure. Disagreeing with a senior leader, that's definitely exposure. Trust determines whether that exposure feels brave or reckless. Let's start with interpersonal trust, probably the most intimate and the form of trust with which we're most familiar. It's the trust between 2 people, between a manager and a team member, between peers, between colleagues. And it forms quietly, not in grand gestures and big moments, but in micro moments, in a reaction to bad news, a response to a mistake, or how we react under pressure. I once worked with a senior leader who genuinely believed he had strong trust with his team. He was approachable, he was informal, he was super smart. But he had one little micro habit. When presented with new ideas, he would immediately improve them. He wouldn't dismiss them. He wouldn't shut them down. He would just improve them within seconds, within nanoseconds. And he thought he was adding value. His team thought that they weren't thinking hard enough. And over time, people stopped bringing him those half-formed ideas. And instead, they brought him finished proposals. And that sounds efficient until you notice that innovation is slowing down. And nothing really dramatic happened in that situation. Trust didn't collapse in a thunder of rubble. It just narrowed. So let's talk about the behavioral architecture of trust. R.I.C.E, the R.I.C.E model. What are people scanning when they decide whether to risk vulnerability? They're not conducting personality assessments. They're observing patterns, and those patterns tend to fall into 4 signals: reliability, integrity, competence, and empathy and vulnerability. So let's unpack those, not as corporate acronyms, but as lived leadership behavior. What is reliability? Reliability is unglamorous. It's not charisma, it's follow-through. You say you'll call? Call. If you say you'll review something, review it. If you say tomorrow, mean tomorrow, not sometime in the next quarter when the stars align. Reliability reduces uncertainty, and that's important because when uncertainty increases, so does vigilance. When people can't predict whether commitments will be honored, they start to compensate. They double-check, they remind, they mentally buffer for disappointment. And that is exhausting. Reliability allows people to stop tracking you. And when they stop tracking you, that means that they can focus on doing other things. They can focus on the work in hand. Here's a subtle thing. Reliability builds trust faster than charm ever will. Charm, yes, it's impressive, it's nice, and it's wonderful to be around. But reliability is stabilizing. And in the longer term, stabilizing wins. Let's talk about integrity. This is about what you do when it's inconvenient. Reliability is about consistency of action, and integrity is about consistency of principle. It's whether your standards apply evenly, whether your ethics survive pressure, inconvenience, and difficult times. It's whether you prioritize what you say you prioritize. Colquitt showed that fairness perceptions strongly predict trust, and fairness is often more about process than outcome. In other words, people don't expect life to be fair and in their favor all the time. But they do expect fair process. If one person's mistake is corrected privately and another's is corrected publicly, that fractures trust. If decisions shift depending on who's in the room, that fractures trust. Integrity is tested when it's inconvenient, when life gets hard, when things get tough. Anybody can uphold values when they cost nothing, when life is easy and sailing is smooth. Trust grows when people see that you uphold them when things are difficult, when it's inconvenient, and they cost you something. Let's talk about competence, which I don't think gets the coverage that it deserves. Kindness alone doesn't build trust. You can be deeply liked and still not fully trusted. Because trust also requires confidence in ability. And research shows that warmth and competence are 2 primary dimensions by which humans evaluate each other. Warmth without competence feels safe, feels nice and warm and fuzzy, but it's risky. Competence without warmth feels capable but distant. And sustainable trust requires both warmth and competence. If decisions feel erratic or poorly reasoned, doubt spreads throughout the organization. Even if your intentions are good, it tells people, I might not know everything, but I'm capable and I'm steering the ship. Well, let's talk now about empathy and vulnerability, something that many leaders, I think, really underestimate. Empathy. It's not sentimentality, it's not indulgence, it's attentiveness. Empathy signals benevolence. That's one of Mayer's key drivers of trust. It communicates, your welfare matters to me, you matter to me, I value you. And when leaders listen without immediately correcting, they build safety. When they acknowledge the emotional impact, they reduce distance. And then there's vulnerability. And that word makes many leaders very nervous. And it shouldn't, because vulnerability doesn't mean emotional oversharing. You don't have to share the deepest depths of what's going on in your personal life. It's about appropriate openness, admitting when you don't have all the answers, acknowledging that maybe you reacted too quickly, saying, I might be wrong. Edmondson's research shows that when leaders model fallibility, the whole team learns more quickly and their learning behavior increases. Why? Well, because perfection is intimidating. Fallibility is human and people trust human beings. So let's zoom out a little bit. Trust doesn't only operate between individuals, it operates collectively. So let's talk about team trust, that collective version. And team trust is the shared belief that the group is safe for interpersonal risk. When team trust is strong, people feel safe to challenge ideas early. They feel safe to talk about their mistakes and surface those mistakes quickly, because energy can now go towards improving and correcting, not managing impressions. When team trust is weak, however, people withhold ideas. They second-guess motives. They protect themselves before protecting the goal. One of the most powerful indicators of team trust is how quickly bad news travels. In high-trust teams, bad news travels fast. In low-trust teams, it moves strategically. And that strategically can often mean slowly. Then we have systemic trust, the invisible foundation. This is a trust in the organization itself, its systems, its processes, its fairness. You don't need to know every decision maker personally to trust a system. You need to believe that the system operates consistently in things like the criteria to get promotion, performance reviews, resource allocation. If these things feel transparent and principled, systemic trust strengthens. If they feel political or opaque or fuzzy, systemic trust erodes. And when systemic trust erodes, interpersonal trust carries way too much weight. Leaders become the only perceived source of fairness. And that's not fair, it's fragile. Strong organizations distribute trust through process, not just personality. I remember a manager who once ended every project debrief the same way. He would say, "What did I miss?" And it wasn't rhetoric, it was genuine. And at first there was silence, and then a mild suggestion, and then real critique. And over time, his team stopped waiting for permission to speak honestly, because reliability plus vulnerability created safety. And trust grew not from that speech, but from repetition, from saying that at the end of every project debrief.
Power and Excellence with Dr. John.
Trust doesn't build in those moments of celebration. It's built quietly, over time, from repetition. It's built slowly, and it can be questioned quickly. And that's not because people are somehow dramatic. It's because their nervous systems are efficient. Baumeister described what we now casually call the negativity bias, the finding that negative events weigh more heavily than positive ones in psychological processing. In other words, 10 fantastic days are normal. And one off day, well, that's memorable. You can be reliable for months or even years, and then one visible breach can become the reference point. And that doesn't mean that trust is fragile. It just means it's sensitive. And sensitivity isn't a weakness, it's self-protection. Because what happens in those moments is that people turn to self-protection. Let's talk about biology for a very brief moment. I promise to be brief. Research by Eisenberger, Lieberman, and Williams demonstrated that social rejection activates the same neural regions associated with physical pain. Just think about that for a moment. Social rejection feels physically painful because the brain doesn't neatly separate social threat and physical threat. So when a leader dismisses somebody abruptly, corrects them publicly, or reacts unpredictably, the body processes it in exactly the same way as it does physical threat. It doesn't process it as a mild professional friction, it processes it simply as a threat. And that means that cortisol rises, attention narrows, and defensiveness increases. And from that moment on, behavior shifts, not dramatically, strategically, and people begin editing. And they test the temperature of the room before speaking. We've all done this, I think, where we have something to say, but we're not quite sure, should I say it? And so people choose safety over contribution. It's safer to just sit in silence than it is to risk being vulnerable in front of the group or in front of a manager. And leaders often experience this shift as maturity or alignment. But we have to be very careful here because very often it can actually be self-protection. So let's talk about trust under pressure. This is the real test. Trust is easy when nothing's at stake, but it's tested when the pressure rises, when deadlines loom, when errors surface, when senior stakeholders become restless. This is when the R.I.C.E model really becomes visible. So let's walk through each element and look at it, what it looks like under stress and strain. Reliability under stress. Under calm conditions, reliability is fairly straightforward. But under pressure, it's really tested. Let's say you promise updates and you forget. You schedule follow-ups but cancel without context. You shorten explanations just because, well, you're busy. From your perspective, you're prioritizing. But from other people's perspective, predictability is weakening. Reliability under pressure isn't about perfection, it's about ownership. This slipped, and here's why. We need to adjust the timeline, here's the plan. Unacknowledged inconsistency erodes trust faster than honest renegotiation. People can handle delays. What we struggle with is ambiguity and uncertainty. So what about integrity? Well, as I said earlier on, integrity is easy when it's convenient, when life is smooth sailing. But it's tested when life gets tougher. Think about this. A high-performing employee breaches a minor policy. How do you respond? Do you respond the same way that you would to somebody who's not performing as well? Everyone's watching. Colquitt showed that perceptions of fairness strongly predict trust and engagement, and fairness is most scrutinized when decisions are difficult. If standards flex based on status, systemic trust fractures. If process is explained clearly and applied consistently, trust can survive even painful outcomes. People don't expect perfection. They do expect principle. And I've seen this so many times where bad behavior is forgiven because, well, he brings in the numbers. Bad behavior is forgiven because, well, she's good at what she does, so, it's all part and parcel. Or that's just who he is. No, that's not fair. It's not fair on the rest of the organization who expect principle. Let's talk about competence under pressure. Nothing tests perceived competence like uncertainty. When information is incomplete and stakes are high, people look for signals. They want to know that you understand, that you have the competence, the ability to deal with the complexity. They want to know, does the reasoning make sense? Are trade-offs acknowledged? Is complexity admitted rather than masked? Warmth without competence feels comforting, yes, but it's fragile. So people don't just need that warmth and charisma. They need to trust that you know what you're doing. Competence without warmth, well, that feels stabilizing, but it's cold. And under pressure, teams need both. They need to know, we've thought this through. We understand the human impact. We understand the complexity. We have the ability to deal with it. And this is important because without all of that, teams grow anxious, and anxiety reduces trust. Competence and confidence in your competence, well, that reduces anxiety and builds trust. Well, let's move on to empathy and vulnerability when things feel just a little bit under pressure. Stress tempts leaders towards control. It's easy. Tone sharpens a little bit. We listen a little bit less. Our tolerance is decreased. Empathy in these situations somehow feels inefficient. We don't have time to be empathetic. We've got bigger fish to fry. We've got more important, more urgent things to deal with. Vulnerability somehow feels risky. But under pressure, they're essential. I remember a leader once opened a crisis meeting by saying, "This is complicated. We're going to make mistakes, but let those mistakes surface early and let's deal with them." How simple and how unbelievably powerful. Because the message to the team there was, okay, we're in this situation, it's uncharted territory, we're going to make mistakes, but let's deal with them early and move on. Edmondson's research demonstrated that teams in psychologically safe environments report more learning behavior, especially under uncertainty. Recognizing the vulnerability of the entire team in these high-pressure situations suggests that uncertainty isn't incompetence, and that protects trust because the team feels safe to make mistakes, to own them, and move on and learn from them. Trust very rarely collapses dramatically in a peal of thunder. It thins and diminishes quietly, and the earliest signal is silence. Not that polite silence, but that strategic silence. Questions decrease, debates shorten, ideas arrive polished and prepackaged. If meetings feel smoother but less energized, that's the time to pay attention, because that might not be the signal that you think it is. Trust might not be strengthening, it might be diminishing. High trust environments feel engaged and robust. They don't feel tense. Low trust environments feel calm but very cautious. They feel tight. They feel unnatural. And cautious cultures might look professional until they need creativity. And because people have learned to be silent, that creativity just isn't there when you need it. Let's talk again about those trust levels. Starting with interpersonal trust. One sharp moment can outweigh 10 calm ones. Repair, therefore, becomes critical. Dirks, Lewicki, and Zahar found that timely acknowledged and corrective action significantly improves trust. In other words, if you react poorly, own it. Say so quickly. Deal with it. Defensiveness deepens rupture. Ownership reduces it. So when you make a mistake, if you react badly, if you behave badly, apologize and move on. Let's talk about team trust. In high-trust teams, bad news travels quickly and freely. It gets to the decision makers. It gets to the people that can actually do something about it quickly and in a timely fashion. In low-trust teams, bad news travels carefully, slowly, if at all. It's buried, it's hidden. And that costs. If you want to test team trust, ask this question. How early do I hear about problems? If the answer is, well, when they're already fairly serious, there's maybe a possibility that trust is a bit thin. How about systemic trust? This is tested most during organizational shifts, when there's a restructure going on, or when there are promotions up for grabs, when there are big decisions on compensation. If processes feel opaque, systemic trust fractures. And when systemic trust fractures, interpersonal trust cannot carry the full weight. Imagine how exhausting it is to be a trusted leader inside a distrusted system. Strong organizations stabilize trust through transparent process, not just personality. Being liked feels good. Being trusted feels steady. And they're not the same thing. They're not identical. You can be charming and unreliable. You can be kind and inconsistent. Trust is built on predictability and principle. And if you want a quick diagnostic of this, ask yourself this. At what point do people tell you about problems? Do they bring them to you early and let you know that they're working on it? Or do they only bring it to you when they have a fully fleshed out solution? Early problem recognition signals trust. Late-stage surprises, well, that signals caution. If your team triple checks their emails before sending them to you, trust might not be as high as you think. Of course, there's no way for you to know that. But if somebody begins a sentence with something like, well, this may be a stupid idea, but that's not self-doubt. That's risk calculation. That's self-protection. That's protecting themselves so that if you turn around and say, well, that's really a ridiculous idea, they can say, yeah, well, I did say that. I said it might be a stupid idea. Trust is visible in how much preamble people use. The more disclaimers that they attach to the beginning of what they're saying, the more caution they're exercising. So let's bring it back to the core. Let's bring it back to R.I.C.E. Trust stabilizes when the four signals align. I can predict you. That's reliability. I can believe you. That's integrity. I can depend on you. That's competence. And I can relate to you. That's empathy and vulnerability. If one of those weakens, the others carry more weight. If all four align, trust becomes durable and strong. Not fragile, durable. And durability is what allows teams to withstand tension without fracturing.
Power in excellence.
But before we wrap up for today, here are your 5 key takeaways from this episode. Number 1, keep fewer promises, but keep them relentlessly. Trust doesn't grow because you promise a lot. It grows because you deliver consistently on the promises that you have made. Number 2, explain the why, especially when it's difficult. People can tolerate tough decisions. What they struggle with are unexplained ones and ambiguity. Number 3, apply standards evenly, especially when it's inconvenient. integrity becomes hyper-visible under pressure, and nothing erodes trust faster than perceived favoritism. Number 4, invite disagreement before you conclude. If you always speak first and decide quickly, don't be surprised if other people agree quickly. And finally, number 5, repair fast instead of defending first. You will react too quickly sometimes, you will misjudge, you will get things wrong. That's not the threat. The threat is defensiveness. Repair builds trust. Own it, repair it, and move on. Trust isn't built in speeches, it's built in patterns, in reliability that reduces uncertainty, in integrity that survives pressure, in competence that steadies anxiety, in empathy that reduces distance. Trust is the invisible infrastructure beneath performance. Without it, authority feels heavy, but with it, authority feels steady. And here's the next step. Trust doesn't eliminate tension, it makes tension usable. In episode 5, we're stepping into conflict, not the dramatic theatrical kind, but the everyday friction that determines whether teams sharpen each other or quietly disintegrate. We'll explore why disagreement feels threatening in low-trust environments and developmental in high-trust ones. We'll look at ego, identity threat, defensiveness, and how trust determines whether conflict strengthens a team or weakens it. Because high-performing teams don't avoid conflict, they metabolize it and they use it. If this episode has resonated with you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe wherever you're listening. It helps the Unseen Advantage reach leaders who want to think more deeply about how they show up. And if this episode made you just a little bit uncomfortable, that's okay, because that's usually where growth lives. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in episode 5 or elsewhere in the Power and Excellence podcast series. Until then, look after yourselves. Bye-bye.
Remember to subscribe to the Power and Excellence podcast.